Hi, my name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors here at Kings Harbor, and thank you so much for utilizing this resource. Our hope for you in anything that we provide is that you would expect transformation, that we could demonstrate love towards you because of the love of God demonstrated to us, that you would have the faith stirred in you to deal with obstacles and to see opportunities, and that ultimately that the kingdom of God would be revealed in every area of your life. And so our hope with this resource is that the Lord would speak to you powerfully.
If you grab your Bibles and go to the book of Jonah, just kidding, we're not going to Jonah. VBS is this coming week, and that's why the stage looks like this. But I feel like if I was more on my game, I would have found a way to work Jonah into this Sunday morning. But I'm not there. I'm just not on that level. And so if nothing else, here's what I hope. I hope that I was talking with Brianna, and she asked the question. She's like, is it too much? Do you think it's too much? I'm like, yeah, it's probably too much. I was like, but I want people to walk away excited about our excitement for VBS. And so, yeah. And so, in fact, before we even move any further, I just want to take a moment. We've got something like 100 kids that are going to be showing up across our campus from Monday till Friday. Many of them are from our own church. Others may be, they were Googling looking for something and they found like, hey, from 9 to 12, you'll take my kids? All right, hope this is not a cult. And then maybe you showed up this morning and you're like, I knew church was weird. I knew it was a cult. I promise you, it's VBS. It doesn't normally look like this. But just think about the opportunity that we have to speak into those kids' lives. And so I don't want to take that for granted. I just want to pause for a second and pray before we move forward. And so will you pray with me both about the word that we're about to hear, but also this week and what the word that these kids are going to hear. And so, Father, I thank you. I thank you for our King's Kids team, our facilities team, the hours that they put in this week. This week was one of those weeks that was no days off, and they were sprinting full speed to get to the starting line of a marathon. And so, Lord, I pray that you would renew their strength, that you would renew their vigor and their energy to invest in the life of kids. And then, Lord, I thank you for the countless number of people who will be a part of making this week happen, the volunteers who will be in groups of kids or leading different games or different lessons or different segments of the week. But, Lord, more than anything, I pray that what we just sang over ourselves, that you would make us more like you, that you would do the same thing in these kids. That they would walk in and they would hear about what it means to dive deep into friendship with you, to know your person and your character, and that they would long to be more like you all the days of their life. And so, Lord, I don't have to ask you to be here because you were here long before any of us walked in. You're here long before we'll crack the text of Galatians. You're here long before the worship team even started rehearsing. And in the same way, you will be here long before any kid puts their feet into this room. But Lord, I pray that you would be here not just in this kind of omnipresent way, but in this really direct, manifest way where we feel and know you through your word and through your people. It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen? Seriously, if you got a Bible, go to Galatians chapter 3. That's where we're going to be. I realized I said, hey, go to Jonah, and then I never told you where to actually go. So we're going to be in Galatians chapter 3. We've been walking through Galatians this summer and just seeing this picture of the gospel both on the ground, how it affects us personally, but also the gospel in the air and what God is doing to make the world new that goes even beyond our personal situations. And in the last several weeks that we've been in this, we've really been kind of getting this picture of Paul's background, Paul's understanding of how he received the gospel, the difficulty that kind of sets up some of the themes of this letter about fellowship with people that maybe have different core or original beliefs than you, and all of those things. But as we move into chapter 3, we're going to begin to feel this shift in the letter where it's no longer Paul talking about the greater situation, but addressing what he sees and what he's worried about with the Galatians. Now, as I say that, the first words are, you foolish Galatians. And I'm just going to say, Paul can get away with some things that I can't get away with. If I walked up here after prayer, you guys were like, I want to be more like Jesus. And I was like, you foolish Corinthians. I don't know what you call somebody from Torrance, and so I decided I was going to make it biblical. So you foolish Corinthians. Y'all would be like, who do you think you are? I'm going to make it look like I'm going to the bathroom, but I'm going to the car, right? Like that's how y'all would do me. And so what you hear in his language is not just frustration, but angst for them. So let me give you our main idea, and then we'll jump into the text. It says this: we, like the Galatians, can fall into the trap of thinking the gospel is only a starting point. God is at work in the beginning, middle, and end of our story. And so again, I want you to wrestle with that. We'll come back to it later in the message. But here's the pieces that I want to pull together, that we, like the Galatians, and so as much as Paul is directly addressing them, in some ways he's directly addressing us. We can fall into this trap of thinking the gospel is only a starting point. But God is at work. Hear that, but God, Tim mentioned it earlier, is at work in the beginning, middle, and end of our story. Let's jump in chapter 3, verse 1. Here's what it says. You foolish Galatians, who has cast a spell on you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified? I only want to learn this thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by the Spirit, are you now finishing by the flesh? Did you experience so much for nothing, if in fact it was for nothing? So then does God give you the Spirit and work miracles among you by you doing the works of the law? Or is it by believing what you heard? Just like Abraham, who believed God and it was credited to him for righteousness. Now, we already mentioned that the beginning is a little rough here, that he calls them out for foolishness, and I'll explain in a second why that seems applicable. But it also seems to be a shift, because it seems like he's no longer talking about a historic situation. He's talking directly to them, and so he's saying, hey, Galatians, I'm trying to grab your attention. And then he uses this language, who cast a spell on you? Now, I don't know what you did when you were growing up watching TV, but for me, we watched a lot of Nick at Night. And so there were shows like I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched, where somebody would like wiggle their nose and something would happen to you. Paul's not referring to that here, but the actual original language, the idiom that this is that somebody has cast the evil eye towards you. Now, again, that doesn't feel that much more clear in our culture, because an evil eye is usually what you give somebody when they say something, but you can't say something back, but you really want to say something back. And so for us, that idea doesn't seem to stick either. But here's the idea that he's trying to get, is that you have been deceived, that you've been deceived through what you're seeing or what you're experiencing, that your mind has been deceived. He actually uses this language in a more clear way in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3 would say this: but if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Let's put the 2 weeks together, because last week he did a lot of work to try and raise their attention that if the Son of God, who loved them and gave himself for them, that if they needed to go back to the works of the law for them to actually receive God's mercy, then he did that for nothing. He wasted his time. The gospel doesn't mean anything. And so now he's putting the two things together, and he's saying, who has convinced you? Who has blinded your mind in such a way that you, who saw Jesus publicly portrayed? And so hear the criticism. Your eyes seem to be deceived, because what you actually saw was Jesus crucified and risen again so that you might know the grace of God. Who's blinded you in such a way that you don't believe what you've seen? So you understand the angst. He's like, that you know this, and somehow your mind has been perverted against this. Oh, foolish Galatians, how did you get here? And then, in very Pauline fashion, he says, I only want to learn this from you. Or other versions may say, I only want to ask you one thing. And then he lists out 5 questions. And so this is a rhetorical argument. And so if you don't, rhetoric is about the art of persuasion. And it's how do you present an idea in such a way that you can convince people to understand. And so oftentimes when somebody asks you a rhetorical question, the goal is not for you to answer them. So on this Sunday morning, when whoever was reading the Bible, this letter to the church in Galatia, people weren't raising their hand. Oh, me. The answer is no. But it's meant to take you down this path of thinking and wrestling with what the person's saying to you. And so here are the questions that he lists out. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by believing what you heard? After beginning by the Spirit, are you now finishing by the flesh? Did you experience so much for nothing? And does God give you the Spirit and work miracles among you by the works of the law or by you believing what you heard? Now, he is asking multiple different questions. I skipped the question, are you being so foolish? I just figured that was just Paul being snarky. But there's a heart to all these questions. That God, by his Spirit, has done something in you. And that did not start by you accomplishing the work of the law. In fact, he's actually introducing some things that are going to be, for the rest of the letter, really key ideas, the spirit versus the flesh. And so let's talk about those. First of all, the understanding of the spirit. Now, depending on your background, when somebody says the spirit, you have different filters that your mind goes through, but maybe the most biblically faithful understanding of the spirit, particularly post-resurrection, is that this is the down payment of new creation. That this is the fullness of God being able to dwell in us. And so then it therefore makes a little bit more sense in the book of Acts when the Spirit falls upon them that they begin to live a life that's different than the life all around them. It's the reason that death is getting pushed back and sickness is getting pushed back and people are giving in ways that blow people's minds, is that new creation, the down payment for new creation has come and they're beginning to live in what we're all going to eventually experience. And so this gift of the Spirit is not just what the Spirit can do, but what the Spirit represents, that the new age, the new creation, the fullness of God has begun to be manifest amongst his people. And so the contrast then seems to be clear about the flesh. However, here's the challenge. Flesh has a range of meanings. Sometimes when you read the word flesh in the scriptures, flesh literally means your human material. There are times when that's being referred to about the limitation, the brokenness, the destruction of human material. Other times it has to do with sinfulness. Later on in the book, he will begin to talk about what does the Spirit produce, thus the fruit of the Spirit, versus what the flesh produces. And when he uses it in that context, it's all sinful things. None of those things in that list that you're like, you know what, I need to go work on that. In a positive way. Like you may need to go work on it in a negative way, like, Lord, take this from me. But it's certainly not like, I want to become more idolatrous. Because he's talking about the sinfulness of the flesh. But that feels weird here because it doesn't feel like, did you receive the Spirit by means of your sinfulness? Again, rhetorical question, but this is not even a very good rhetorical question because nobody's going to be like, you know, there was that one time where the Spirit came when I was, like, that doesn't work that way. So he must be referring to something outside of sinfulness. It feels like it would be weird to say that is God working miracles according to your physical material. And so he seems to be having a broader idea that encapsulates those more specific understandings. And that seems to be this idea of the frailty of the human condition. And so he's asking this question of them. Hey, has God worked among you in the way that he has because of some human invention, human system, something natural to the human condition, or is it because he's done something because you believed him through faith? And then he begins to pit this tension between faith and works against one another. Here's what I don't want you to be deceived by. I don't want you to be deceived that Paul is somehow saying that spiritual experience internally matters, but external experience is dangerous. I think what he's trying to point to is, have you aligned yourself with the grace that God has given and trusted that? We talked about the faith last week, meaning a couple of things. One, it means the faithfulness of Jesus, and two, it means our response to that. And so have you trusted the faithfulness of Jesus in such a way that it marks you, or are you, by your own ability, trying to make this happen? And then as he ends this section asking these rhetorical questions to which every single one of them, the answer should be, after beginning in the Spirit, should you finish in the flesh? Well, the answer is no. Did you gain the Spirit by works of the law? Well, the answer is no. Did you see God give you the Spirit, give you this guarantee, this down payment of the new reality, the new creation that is to come that you get to be a part of? Did you do that by works of the flesh? It's almost the same question again. The answer is no. But then he makes the statement, just like Abraham who believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness. Now, if you're reading in the CSB, which is the version we typically use, it's bolded compared to the other text. And the reason that it's doing that is to let you know that Paul is quoting something. He's actually quoting from the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, we're introduced to the story of Abraham. In fact, the story of Abraham is an interesting story, particularly in this context, because a lot of what Paul is going to do here in just a moment is talk about God's heart for the nations that goes beyond just an individual person or his direct family. And so if you're reading through the book of Genesis, in the book of Genesis, it begins with the story of God creating the world with Adam and Eve and them being called to be fruitful and multiply, particularly in the garden. Now, after sin, they're no longer in the garden, and you begin to see the rest of humanity begin to play out, and it just seems to be getting worse every name that you read. Enoch is this exception, and Enoch is so exceptional that the Lord doesn't even let him die. The Lord just takes him up, and then it just keeps getting worse. To the point where you get to Noah, and it's so bad, and the Lord's like, hey, we got to fix this. And he floods the world to remove the wickedness. And though he says he'll never do that again, we recognize we've got a problem here. That post-eating of the fruit of Eden, we're going to continue to see something multiply, but not in the way that we intended for it to do so. And so as you continue to read the story, you continue to see the brokenness, even Noah's own brokenness. And even after you get past Noah, you begin to see this table of nations, and you see that people are spreading. But even as people are spreading, one of the dangerous things is in the middle of that there's this empire, this Tower of Babel that's being built, where people are building, trying to amass their own glory. And then after the Lord confuses their language and stops their building project, He then drops in the story about this man named Abram and his family, his dad Terah and his brothers. And it's like, we got super big, and now all of a sudden we're back in this one small family. And what we learn about this man Abram is that this Abram and his wife Sarai, they want to have children, but they are far too old to have children. And then the Lord in Genesis 12 begins to make a promise to them that I'm going to give you children, to which they're like, how's that going to happen? Time passes and you drop into Genesis chapter 15, but even just before that, there's this story that Abraham's got this nephew named Lot. Lot is that nephew. If you're like, I don't know who that nephew is, you might be that nephew. And so they're beginning to amass the goodness of God in terms of possessions, because God not only promises Abraham a family, but also promises him land and possessions. And as the Lord's doing that, there's so much stuff that they got to separate. And so Lot goes off, ends up at Sodom and Gomorrah, ends up getting captured. And so Abraham has to amass people from his house, go rescue his nephew because he's that nephew. And then has this moment where this king named Melchizedek comes and honors him, and he gives Melchizedek everything a tenth, and that's a forward-looking picture to Jesus. And then there's this other king named Chadamar who shows up, and he's like, hey, man, if you give me your people back, I'll give you a bunch of stuff. And Abraham's like, nah, man, I don't want that from you. We'll take what my servants ate, and we don't want to have anything else, because we don't have any claim that what God has given us belongs somehow to you. So when you get to Genesis 15, the reason I told you all of that was because it says after these events, and I needed you to know what these events were. Didn't want you to feel left out. The word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you give me, since I am childless and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? Abram continued, look, you've given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Verse 4. Now the word of the Lord came to him. This one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars. If you were able to count them, then he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And so here what Paul's doing, because it wasn't just this random, I got to insert a biblical name here, Abraham. It was what God is doing to keep his promises. What God is doing to show you that he is going to make good, that there's going to be a guarantee of what he said he's going to accomplish. That thing, did you achieve it because your body was able to do it in your human condition? Or were you able to do it because God is faithful by his power to keep his promises and to bring you along into them? He's saying, like, look at the story of Abraham, because Abraham has got this promise several chapters back from the Lord. Hey, I'm going to do something in you that's going to multiply you like sand on the seas of the shore, that the nations are going to be blessed through you. Like, all of this is going to happen. And then several chapters later, he's like, no, it still hadn't happened yet. You said you're going to give me offspring. I ain't got no offspring. I got a slave in my house. Is that the way you're going to do this? And he said, no. It's not going to be by some means that you can come up with through your human condition. It's going to be me keeping my promises. And it says, and this is what happened. Abraham believed him. Here's what happens next. After Abraham believes him, God then ratifies this covenant. And so it's this belief that brings him into this covenant relationship where he gets to see the fullness of God's goodness towards him. And this is the question that Paul is trying to ask. What got you here? What was it? Because you figured out the right things to do? It certainly wasn't because you lived under the law, Galatians, because you didn't live under the law. What got you into the gracious, merciful relationship with God that you have is that God promised you his goodness through the message of what Jesus has done, and you believed him. So I said it this way. Switching from God's grace to a flawed human system is not faithfulness. It's foolishness. Now, I'm not calling you fools. I'm just saying that's not the exchange you want to make. That if we assume that some other system, and so in this text, the question is, are you going to do the works of the law? Are you going to be obedient to Torah, specifically the outward observances of festivals and circumcision and the way that you eat? Like, if you're going to do those things and think that they are going to ultimately rescue you, he's like, that's not faithfulness. It's foolishness. And we could update the reference and we could insert whatever we wanted to insert in there for our day and age. But if you're going to rely on a flawed human system, it will not be faithful. It would be foolish. And then verse 7, he says this. You know then that those who have faith, these are Abraham's sons. So while I read this, if you want to sing to yourself, Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons have Father Abraham. If you're like, I don't know that song, just pretend you do. Now the scripture saw in advance that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and proclaim the gospel ahead of time to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed through you. Consequently, those who have faith are blessed with Abraham, who had faith. Faith is the only prerequisite in Abraham's story of covenant relationship with God. So much so that he would say, the reason I'm pointing to Abraham is not because it's just a good example of how God does things, but it's also the reality of your story also. So therefore, if you walk in faith, if you have responded in faith and trust to the faithfulness of Jesus, then you are considered the children of Abraham, to whom God said, I'm going to make you so numerous that you can't be counted. Not only is faith the only prerequisite, but he goes on to say, your inclusion of in God's people is evidence that God has kept that promise. Because he said God was saying to Abram that the nations are going to be blessed through you, and now Galatians, who didn't exist way back then, who are not biologically, ethnically part of Abraham's family, you are now part of the family of God. And so the family of God, the family tree lines have all of a sudden been redrawn. They are now no longer just these people who happen to have so-and-so as their great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy. But you get pulled in because of what Jesus has done. God is fulfilling his promises. But the thing that blows my mind about these few verses is what he would say that he proclaimed the gospel ahead of time to Abraham, saying, and here's his explanation of the gospel, all the nations will be blessed through you. Wait. If I at the end of service said, I don't know where you are in your life right now. I don't know what sin you're struggling with, but would you just raise your hand if you want all the nations to be blessed? You would be like, I thought this was about me. I thought this was about how Jesus was going to fix my problems and make me feel better. That's not Paul's proclamation of the gospel here. It is not anything on the ground that has to do with somehow guaranteeing that Abram is going to end up in heaven because his sins were forgiven. It actually had to do with that through you, God is doing a bigger thing to bring more people into his family. That the same covenant relationship that he's starting right now with you, he's pulling other people into. And that this is the good news of the gospel that was being proclaimed to him. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 is where that happens. I referred to it earlier, but let me read it specifically. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, your father's house, to the land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples, all the ethne, all the nations on the earth will be blessed through you." It's as if Paul is saying that, hey, you are part of that story, and the story is going to be extended through you. Not because you did all of the right things, but because you had faith in the faithfulness of Jesus. And here's how I know that to be true about you, because the Lord gave you the Spirit as the guarantee that you are part of this new creation. But what I don't want you to miss is that what God is specifically calling Abram to do is not a new thing. It's just restating the original thing. And so when God says to Adam and Eve, hey, be fruitful and multiply and fill and subdue the earth, he's not like, hey, have enough kids that you can be on a Lifetime TV show. What he's saying is, take my image and multiply it to the rest of the world. And the more that my image through you is multiplied through other people, it's going to make the world what it ought to be. It's going to have the world ordered rightly and operating rightly, that you represent me in the world. And the more of you that are representing me, the more the world is going to be what I intended for it to be. So really what he's saying to Abram when he shows up and says, hey, here's what I'm going to do through you. Leave your family, leave what you know, leave what's familiar. Trust me, I will make you a great nation and I will multiply you. He's saying, I'm asking you to make the world Eden again. That I'm calling you like I called Noah before you, like I'll call those that come after you to re-Edenize the world, and that the world will be blessed, that the nations will be blessed, that the world will know me, and that my image will be multiplied through you. And so now it changes the conversation. Now it's no longer, hey, people who come from your bloodline, that they all of a sudden get to only be the people of God, but now everybody's eligible. Now no more is the conversation, hey, Abram, that you get this one piece of land, but now you get to fill the earth like the water has filled the seas with my glory, that all of it belongs to us. And so I wrote it this way. The gospel's always been bigger than our personal salvation. God is still re-Edenizing the world. So let me say it this way. Every time that God calls us into something, he's extending the story through you. And so God is stirring them, and that this is the proclamation of the gospel, that places are going to be blessed by you. And so I know for some of you that the reason that you signed up to go to Royal Family is because we twisted your arm and showed you enough videos and made you feel bad enough, and maybe somebody showed up at your house and said, we'll give you cookies. But maybe what you missed was that you have an opportunity amongst kids who've been impacted by foster care to re-Edenize the world. Yes. That when we stand up and say, hey, you've got an opportunity to go to the Philippines, that we're not just saying, hey, if you ever want to go and get on a plane and go to somewhere where you've never been before, but if you want to re-Edenize the world, step in and re-Edenize the world. That when we call you to be somebody that's proclaiming and living out the gospel in your neighborhood, that we're saying that your neighborhood is going to be blessed through you, that God's extending the story to people who wouldn't normally be part of the story, that he's redrawing the family lines and saying when you show up and show what the world could be like under the rule and reign of God, because the Spirit exists in you, that all of a sudden that your neighborhood gets re-Edenized, that the nations get re-Edenized, that your workplace gets re-Edenized, that your ball team gets re-Edenized, that your hobbies get re-Edenized, that the world is coming back under the rule and reign of Jesus when you show up in the place representing God like Abram chose to. But the gospel has always been bigger than just when you die, will you get in? The gospel says that you have been allowed in now. Who else are you going to invite to know the same type of goodness? So our main idea again, we, like the Galatians, can fall into the trap of thinking the gospel is only a starting point. God is at work in the beginning, middle, and end of our story. I only got 2 points, and we'll be done. That was all preamble to get you to what I want. No, I'm kidding. Have you ever had things that people say that they sound good and they sound wise until you try to apply them to your lived experience? Like, have you ever, when I was dating and I would go through a breakup, people would be like, well, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. I'm like, really? Because I actually don't think that's true. I spent a whole lot of money having loved and lost. Or when people will say to you things like, it doesn't matter where you start, it just matters where you finish. I mean, maybe. And that's what you say to people who don't get off to a good start. But people who start well, you're all like, well, it doesn't matter that you're in the lead. Just like, and I would dare say to you that Paul is defying that conventional wisdom. I think it actually does matter where you start. Because that's the question that he's asking them. Did you start by some method of your own, or did you start by the graciousness of God through his Son to give you the Spirit? It actually matters that you start there. When I was in high school, I ran cross country. I was a sprinter, but I thought, man, I'm going to be a team player. I'm going to run cross country with these guys. I didn't realize it was 3.2 miles. And they didn't need my help. Because I think he probably still holds a bunch of records. One of the guys I ran with, his name was Chris McWaters, was unbelievable. Like, I never saw him lose a race in the 2 years that we were on the team together. But there was one meet in particular that usually his method was he would get out there, he would run the course so that we had a good sense of the course, knew the starting line all the way to the finish line. And he took off on the course during the race, but he hadn't pre-run it. Got out in the lead in front of everybody, didn't know where to turn, turned the wrong way, went off course, got back on course, and still beat everybody by 3 minutes. Unbelievable. But it still matters where you start. It still matters that he had no idea how to run the course because he didn't start the way he normally starts. And so I would dare say to you that we should not think, well, it doesn't really matter how we start, it matters how we finish, and so therefore we can switch things up, because what Paul would say to us in Galatians is, you've started well. He actually literally will say this later in the book. You've started well. Who hindered you? Why'd you change course in the middle of this thing? Where you started was good and right. It actually matters that you started there. You started because of the grace and the mercy of God. Don't deviate from that. It matters how you start and how you finish. And here's the second thing. I'm going to confess something to you. I really love the Fast and the Furious movies. Now, here's the thing. Some of you are going to judge me because of that. Some of you who live with me already judge me because of that. But here's what I know. That I'm accepted of the Lord not because of what movies I watch, but because of the faithfulness of Jesus. But I'm not going to lie to you and say that they're good movies. They're not. Nor am I an aggressive driver. I actually drive very unaggressively. But when you're watching those movies, inevitably, every time, here's what will happen. They'll be driving, and the person that they're trying to rescue is getting rescued, and then Vin Diesel will look over them and say something about family. And then he'll climb out of the car and will stand on top of the car and make the person drive who they're trying to rescue, which if that person was able to rescue themselves, why do they need Vin Diesel in the first place? And so it's weird that he's driving them, getting them out of trouble, and then halfway getting them out of trouble, he gets out of the car, gets on top of the car, and is like, hey, you drive yourself. Because here's the principle. What got you here will keep you here. And so if you are incapable in and of yourself of rescuing yourself halfway through the story, you don't take over the wheel. And so Paul is pointing to this reality that, hey, the thing that got you here is the thing that's going to keep you here. And that should actually be one of the greatest comforts that you've ever received. That God is not midway through the story saying, hey, I think I've gotten you enough out of trouble. You take over the wheel of your life. I think you got this. But instead, that he's saying that the very grace that I have given you by my Spirit to begin to transform who you are from the person that you used to be to the person that's more like Jesus. That I'm not going to leave you partway through and expect you to figure this out on your own, but instead, by my Spirit, I'm going to continue to mature you and strengthen you and empower you to be who I called you to be. And so therefore, if you're sitting here saying, man, I feel stuck and I don't want to know what to do next, then I'm just going to tell you what got you here is what's going to keep you here. And so don't deviate from the course of God's mercy for you that he's given through his Son and through his Spirit and say, all right, now I've got to figure this out myself. I just confess to you, I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, and we were talking about the Lord's mercy for us and how oftentimes when he's maturing us, that he doesn't expose everything at the same time because it would drive you wild. But oftentimes he exposes the things on the surface first. The things that you already know, I probably shouldn't do that. And then once you get past those things, he starts getting to the roots of your heart. And when he starts getting to the roots of your heart, why you did the thing that you know that you shouldn't do, that's when you're like, I don't know how I'm going to fix this. And he's not suddenly like, well, helped you with the easy stuff. You're on your own. Hey, you figured out addition. Good luck with calculus. But instead, the very same mercy of God that helps you with the stuff in the beginning the same mercy of God that's going to help you with the stuff in the middle of the story. And I imagine as I live longer, I'm going to find things behind those things that are behind the things that I'm like, just take me, Jesus. I'm just ready to go home. And at that moment, the very same grace and mercy that he had back when he very first saved me and the way that he's carrying me through this season will be the same mercy that he has for me then. As a believer in Jesus, don't be discouraged.
Thank you, Jesus.
The Lord's not saying if you were more mature, you would have figured this out on your own. He's saying the very same faithfulness that you trusted this far is the faithfulness that will lead you home. Lean into that. Let's pray. Lord, thank you. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you that your desire for us is not that we would become so self-sufficient that we no longer needed you. That is the flawed human condition that will not prove to be faithful, but will prove to be foolish. Lord, I pray that you, by your mercy, would show us that the good news of the gospel, both for us on the ground and what it's doing in us, but also for what it does for others, and even the recognition that the very mercy that we continue to need is the very mercy that's available to others. That, Lord, that it would lift our heads up, that it would straighten our backs, that it would put this level of ferocity back in our chest, that as we call out to you, that we would know that we're not somehow off the pace, but instead that we are right where you expect us to be. And what got us here will take us all the way home. Grant us the recognition of that. It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen.
Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.